In today's Diablo 4 video, we're going to take a deep dive into the Rogue class. It's by far my most played character in the beta and definitely one of my favorites. I also believe it's one of the fastest to reach a very strong build earlier than most other classes. As mentioned in my first impressions video, we weren't allowed to record our own gameplay, so instead I'll show you the one provided by Blizzard. And I also have you keep in mind that some of these can and will change until launch. That being said, the Rogue is a very versatile class with strong options for both melee and range specs via double daggers, bows and crossbows, as well as additional access to traps, caltrops, and my favorite, skill imbuements. Between all of the spec combos I tried, I felt melee was definitely the strongest options at the stage I was playing at, but I'll talk about different other build scenarios too. Going over a quick skill tree breakdown, the starting basic node already gives access to 2 ranged abilities for bows and crossbows. One of them is Heartseeker, an enemy-seeking arrow shot that can be further modified to also ricochet an additional arrow off the primary target. This is also the one that I used in the ranged build, though in hindsight the next skill would have worked slightly better. This is the Forceful Strike. This fires a more powerful arrow shot that can make enemies vulnerable and can also be modified to throw enemies back into one another for some extra AoE damage. For melee, the two options are Invigorating Strike. This is a great one to deal damage and can further be modified to increase energy regen by a massive amount. This is also the one that I chose since the build I was using heavily relied on spamming energy-heavy abilities like Flurry or Arrow Barrage. Blade Shift is the other one, a quick stab mechanic that provides a buff that lets you freely move through targets, and you can even further modify this to debuff while you're moving through them or have the Blade Shift stun them in place. And finally, the fifth one is a short distance option called Puncture. This is more of a close to mid-range blade throw that can slow enemies down after 3 strikes or after doing a critical strike. Now things start becoming a lot more interesting by the time you hit the second node, which deals with core skills, the ones that actually cost energy to cast but are also stronger than the basic attacks. I'm only going to talk about the options I found strongest here, and for the ranged variant I immediately went with Barrage. This is basically the skill you see shooting a lot of arrows in a wider cone in some of these shots, but it's totally worth it. What makes this skill so great is the fact that arrows automatically have a chance to ricochet off targets, chance that you can turn into a guaranteed trigger with its first enhanced version upgrade, so you can get extra AoE right off the bat. I found this to be a perfect combination with Shadow Imbuement that comes in later in the 5th node. With its spread and ricochet, this ensures you affect entire large groups of enemies with the Shadow Imbuement, and then if you do a second imbued barrage, you basically get to detonate all of them and essentially one-shot entire groups. Given its wide spread, I also found this was best used in a mid-range situation rather than staying too far away and losing precious DPS. The other skill I found very strong this time around for the melee build was Flurry. This basically unleashes a flurry of attacks in front of you that I found to be especially devastating and a bit less energy costing than the Barrage skill. This can even be further modified to heal you on almost every hit and even debuff enemies with vulnerability. What truly made this what I would say overpowered at that stage I was playing at was the interaction between it, Shadow Imbuement, and an early on rogue aspect that would cause a second flurry to be auto-casted whenever I would attack targets that were already made vulnerable by the flurry skill. And considering that you'd cause vulnerability all the time with the flurry, this triggered on almost every other hit, which in my experience quickly defeated bosses and instantly one-shotted almost anything below it. In the 3rd node, called Agility, there's 3 main active skills that I found really good, the first one being Shadow Step. This one lets you instantly appear behind the enemy, stab them for massive damage, and gain a 50% movement speed afterwards. You can even modify this to immobilize enemies for a couple of seconds, and I found it to be especially useful on the melee build whenever fighting elites or even bosses. The other skill I used was the dash. This was more useful for traversal reasons as it gives you 2 charges with it on only a 10-second cooldown, and you get to dash forward by a considerable amount. It's also decent for combat in case you want to deal damage, and it definitely benefits from Imbuement Skills as well. In this category, there's also the caltrops. I didn't use these too much, but they can be pretty decent defensive-wise, as this lets you leap backwards and then throw caltrops on the ground to deal damage over time and even slow enemies that walk through them. This could be a solid option since many of the bosses tend to charge at you all the time and you might want to like run away from their attacks, so slowing them down a little bit can definitely make a difference. Now in the fourth node, I will admit I did not spend many points and eventually even entirely skipped it because the active abilities I found here were not that useful for the build I was running with. In the imbuement category, this is, as I've said, one of the strongest in there and pretty much game defining for the class. This is the fifth node and there's multiple ways in which you can build your class. There's 3 types of imbuments in total, with frost, poison, and finally shadow being the options. Personally, I found the shadow to be the strongest for my setup, though poison is another great one for single target bosses. The shadow imbues your skills so that the next 2 times you use them, it deals shadow damage and also infects them with a debuff that makes them explode on death. This can be further modified so that critical hits also have a chance to cause extra explosions on top of the one on death. In actual practice, this means that you only need to ever cause one enemy to die or explode, which in turn would instantly cause a chain reaction so that every single surrounding enemy will further explode and unleash a massive AoE that basically deletes entire groups. Gameplay wise, it looks as cool as it sounds and remains one of my favorite abilities in the entire game. The poison imbuement is also a strong one for tougher single targets, as you get to apply a poison dot that deals significant damage and it doesn't need too much to reach that point. There's even a modifier for it that doubles the effect, so it can definitely be worth it. But once you get specializations going, here is where the class becomes like truly next level. In the demo, the rogue class had access to 2 of the 3 specializations. This includes the combo points and the inner sight, with the preparation not being accessible until level 30. You of course have to unlock these through a class quest that starts at around level 7, and then you get to unlock the second one at 20 and finally the one for 30. Combo points is the first specialization you unlock and the most straightforward. Your basic skills will now generate up to 3 combo points, and then you can consume them with certain skills for additional effects. You can of course see these effects on the skill card itself and what you get at 1, 2 and full 3 combo points. Usually this involves doing a lot more damage, giving you an extra buff, or debuffing enemies in one way. For example, the Flurry skill at 3 combo points, it would give you basically more than double damage bonus as well as double attack speed duration buff compared to its normal default state. But I found the inner sight specialization to be by far the most OP, especially coupled with the shadow imbuement and the arrow barrage skill. On its own, this specialization marks random enemies, which will then cause your gauge called inner sight to start filling every time you deal damage to that marked target, thus providing unlimited energy for 4 seconds once that gauge is fully filled. In single target scenarios, like when you fight a single boss, this means that you always get to fill that inner sight gauge very fast, which essentially results in almost always having infinite energy right off the bat for extremely high damage attacks. So you can basically spam a very powerful barrage skill almost constantly, as you constantly fill that with the skill itself too. This meant just deleting bosses in no more than a few seconds. Now, on top of these, there's also a 6th and even 7th final node tree that essentially gives you ultimate skills and then a build-defining passive that you have to make a choice for. So for the 6th node, the one that deals with ultimate skills, one of the abilities I found especially useful was the Shadow Clone. As the name implies, you call upon a clone that mimics all of your actions, including the skill cast for up to 15 seconds, dealing up to 60% of your own damage. Suffice to say that this was incredible with the inner sight barrage setup I was just mentioning, as it would mean melting bosses in the beta in 5 seconds or less. Not sure if this is going to change before the game comes out, but it's totally super powerful. Another option you'll see in this B-roll is the Death Trap. This places a trap that arms after about 1.25 seconds, dealing massive damage in an area. This can further be upgraded to also pull targets in and even reduce the cooldown if it kills any enemies during its activation. And of course, there's the final one, Rain of Arrows, that we saw as a ranged option in many of the gameplay trailers and shots up until now, but personally, I did not use it that much. Finally, the remaining 7 skill node gives you an option between 5 passives that makes whichever build you create a lot more complete. To give you an example, there is a passive in there called Victimize that has a 30% chance when dealing damage to vulnerable enemies to cause an explosion, dealing 23% of the original damage to surrounding enemies. This would be a perfect combo with the Flurry Shadow Imbuement combo, which already applies vulnerability to multiple targets easily, so you can just cause massive explosions all around from 3 sources. Another is the close quarters combat, where close range and melee skills will grant you an attack speed buff. During its effect, any damage against crowd control enemies have a 75% chance to restore 10 energy and deal 15% more damage. This would work best with the Barrage skill and the Frost Imbuement, since you get to apply lots of crowd control from it, and you can also pretty much stay relatively close to enemies so that you can hit all of them with the Barrage skill. There's 3 more, including Exposure, more suited for a trap build. This makes your damage against enemies affected by a trap to have a 35% chance of reducing the cooldown of your traps, and even more so to further drop clusters of stun grenades. You can definitely create a legit trap master build with this setup if you also get the 7th one and focus on tons of traps and stuns and kind of like go with that option. There's finally also momentum and precision in this final category. One of them gives you a mechanic that further increases some of your defenses, energy regen, and attack speed. And then the precision one just gives you a lot of critical strike bonuses. But yeah, that's pretty much it for the range skills. In any case, Rogue is definitely a class that will not disappoint. I, of course, will cover a lot more as we're allowed to talk more about some of these things or maybe even show them. But in the meantime, this is the breakdown that I wanted to do for now. Look forward for more class breakdowns following with the Sorcerer and eventually the Barbarian in the next couple of days. So if you want to stay up to date with everything Diablo 4 related, totally make sure you subscribe, activate the notification bell, and also leave a like, because why not? This is pretty much it. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.